As much as I can't stand President Trump, when I conducted my own analysis into the past 80 years of global trade, I have to acknowledge that President Trump's trade war using tariffs actually makes sense when you look at the long-term strategy that would benefit the US. However, in this video, I claim that it will not pan out the way that they think it will. And so today's episode 13 of my Why series, we're going to look into why Trump is starting a trade war. The S&P 500 and global markets are in utter turmoil right now. We had the worst crash since 2020, almost $5 trillion of market capitalization wiped, and we're about to enter a bear market. A bear market is what Wall Street defines as a 20% drop in the S&P 500 or a large index over a certain period of time. And this is being triggered by Trump's new tariffs, where he enacted 10% on all countries and goods, and then he released these two charts showing all of the different tariffs and the reciprocal tariffs that are going to happen between certain countries. And so right now we're in this tit for tat trade war where countries are enacting reciprocal tariffs on us, and overall the market outlook is very bleak. And so this begs the question, what is the Trump administration trying to accomplish by pretty much upending the current global trade system? And so to answer this question, I'm going to give you a historical analysis starting with the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement, and then we're going to go into neoliberalism started by Ronald Reagan, and then finally what the outcome of neoliberalism was and why the US feels that they have been sort of at the loss of it. Okay, so my thesis in today's video is going to be that the US designed the system that ultimately led to its own demise. And this is a very bold claim, but I'm going to show you the historical evidence of this, okay? The Bretton Woods Agreement established four major outcomes. First, the International Monetary Fund to stabilize global currencies. Second was the World Bank to help rebuild war-torn countries through loans. Third, the US dollar became the global reserve currency, meaning that countries would use a fixed exchange rate, making the US dollar the standard, and the US dollar was pegged to gold as its backing asset. Fourth was that the US would provide military support to its allies. And what the outcome of Bretton Woods was a shift in ideology and long-term diplomatic relations from the US perspective. So prior to Bretton Woods and World War II, the US looked at the global economy through three lenses. First, protectionism, where they wanted to protect American economies and manufacturers. And second was currency devaluations, right? During the Great Depression, we had a decrease in global trade and we had rampant inflation. And third was economic depression. And so the US looked at these three factors, and when it was engineering the New World Order post-World War II, the US realized that economic depression, instability, currency fluctuations are going to lead people more towards fascism, these same drivers that led to World War II. And so the US decided that even though it was going to create an economic system where many countries benefited from this at the expense of the US still said that it was the better long-term investment because it would make the US the de facto world leader in economics and in military power, gave these other countries, the 44 nations in the Bretton Woods Agreement, access to the largest consumer base, which was the US. They allowed that to happen because their ideology was that if countries became richer, then richer countries make stronger allies. And during World War II, we had the Allied and the Axis powers, right? But then post-World War II, we enter the Cold War era, where you had the US versus the Soviet Union, and that was basically a showdown between capitalism and communism. And so the US realized that if they wanted to fight against communism, they needed rich capitalistic countries. And so they allowed countries in Europe, Germany and Japan, to build their economies up in the hopes that they would become US allies and they would be rich countries. This is really important, guys. If you've ever wondered how the US went from being enemies of Japan and Germany to being economic allies, well, it was during this time. So, for example, in 1948, you had the Marshall Plan, where the US was investing tons of money into Europe, particularly Western Europe and Germany. And then they were also occupying Japan after the war to establish its new democracy, establish the capitalism economy. The US literally went into these countries and injected US values and US capitalist economies into them. And so when we look at the history of global free trade, we have to acknowledge that this was done by the US. It was designed and led by the US. And the reasoning at the time was very sound, right? That you want your allies to be rich because they viewed communism as the biggest threat to the American values. And so now we go into the 1970s, where you have rampant inflation, oil prices are exploding, and we see that there is kind of like the cracks of this free trade system begin to show. Because what it did is that it incentivized countries to start hoarding US dollars, right? Because if the US dollar is that strong and global currencies are much weaker compared to the US dollar, well then countries' treasuries are going to have an incentive to hold US dollars in their reserves, right? And then they'll come in and they'll trade it for gold. And so what happened is that the US began to lose a little bit of its manufacturing power during this time, but its actual amount of gold that the US had compared to the amount of US dollars in circulation was beginning to become imbalanced. And so this was actually something that I had to look into, because when I was analyzing, like, what is the goal of MAGA, right? Like, what is Trump trying to achieve? We have to deep dive into Trump's economic advisors, right? And the two main guys are US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and the economic advisor Stephen Miran. And Stephen Miran wrote a paper, I'll link it in the description. And one of the arguments that he makes is that because of this dilemma where the US dollar was in high demand and freely circulating in all countries, but the US didn't have enough gold to back it up, we get to what happened in 1971, which is called the Nixon shock. And the Nixon shock is that President Nixon declared that the US dollar will no longer be pegged to gold anymore. And this was very important, guys, because after this point, we see a shift in the New World Order, which is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism began in the 1980s, engineered by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. If you guys stick enough long on this channel, you're going to see many videos where I cannot stand the policies of President Ronald Reagan. I know he is kind of like what many Republicans view as like the model politician, right? And there were many good things that came out of Reagan's presidency, but one of the things that contributed to today's global trade deficits and issues is this new neoliberalism that was coming out. Neoliberalism was marked by four main things. One, deregulation of industries. Two, tax cuts, particularly for the rich. Third, union busting. And fourth, free trade agreements. So, for example, Reagan was the first one to put out the idea that we should have a free trade zone in North America. And that later passed on to the later presidencies, and then Bill Clinton was actually the one that signed NAFTA. But you had Reagan, then you had George H.W. Bush and Clinton. They all kind of went with this idea that originated from Reagan on the idea of NAFTA. And so that's why I say this global trade system, when I put the blame, I put it on the US. I don't necessarily put it on one person or one party, because we see that this was a bipartisan agreement, right? Both Republicans and Democrats agreed that they wanted more free trade in this era. So from 1980s onward to, I would say, about 2016, when Trump ended this, we're in this kind of neoliberal free trade era. And if you watched my previous videos on this tariff series, you'll know that the free trade era pretty much started in like the 1934-ish to now. Well, this is an even deeper dive into that, because within the free trade era, we have smaller eras. that have very distinct outcomes. And so what this neoliberalism era did is that it made the US push for more free trade, but the key thing here is that it allowed companies to offshore their manufacturing to cheaper labor in other countries such as China and Vietnam. And I really want you guys to catch this, because during this era, we have the World Trade Organization formed, we had NAFTA, and then in 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization. And from here, we see what three economists call the China shock. And the China shock was basically an analysis done by these three economists, and they said that basically, when China began to enter the World Trade Organization and became a major factor in global trade, they attribute almost 2 to 2.4 million US jobs were lost as a result of this competition from China. And so what they claim is that during this time, US manufacturing declined significantly, and what was left is an entire demographic of Americans that were pretty much forgotten, disenfranchised. We call them the Rust Belt, mostly in the Midwest and the South. And these towns that heavily relied on industries such as auto parts, steel, and textiles were pretty much devastated. And that analysis looks at not just the economic impact, but also like the social issues that surrounded it. So we see that in these areas where the manufacturing jobs were lost, they have higher suicide rates, higher abuse of drugs, more breakdown of the family unit, right? More divorce. There's there's more wealth inequality, and this demographic of Americans were largely college uneducated, right? Because they were working these blue collar manufacturing or construction jobs. And so this is something that when you kind of like look at the timeline, like if you were to plot this on a graph, you can see that there were multiple factors that were coming into play. Because you have the fact that the US dollar is not pegged to gold anymore. You have countries that have high circulation of the US dollar. So the US dollar is very strong. And what that does is that it allows the US consumer to become rich, because the US dollar is so strong, and then you have these other countries like China that are producing very cheap imports, right? So they're exporting the goods, but the US is importing them. And so when I looked at my analysis, some economists say that the China shock actually made the average American wealthier. They were able to go to, let's say, Walmart, Target, Costco, and buy goods that were significantly cheaper, and they were using the US dollar, which is the most valuable currency in the world. And so you see kind of like this divide. Another factor I want to throw in here is the change in technology, automation, college, and the rise of white versus blue collar jobs in the US. So while the US blue collar jobs in manufacturing and construction were decreasing, we see an increase in white collar jobs and a higher emphasis on college education. So there are kind of like four things happening at the same time right now in the US in the past few decades. You have this entire population, we're talking like millions of Americans that have lost their manufacturing jobs to foreign competitors, while at the same time, other Americans are being uplifted and climbing the socioeconomic ladder through college and by gaining white-collar jobs, which typically pay more. So you see this increasingly severe wealth inequality divide between the blue-collar workers and the white-collar workers in America. And add on to the fact that we now have technology and automation, which kind of wiped out a lot of those manual labor jobs. And you see now that this is like a perfect recipe, like the perfect storm for a clash in the US between social class, wealth, and then on top of that, you have this foreign competition. And so that's how we can think about Trump's rise, right? Because Trump in 2016 came in and basically said, we need to make America great again. Well, what does he mean by great and what does he mean by again? I argue that the great that he is talking about is when America was a manufacturing powerhouse. And the again part is essentially before neoliberalism. $1 million question is, what is Trump's game plan? Why is he starting this trade war? Because we know the historical context, but now we need to look at what's happening today. My argument is that Trump's economic advisors are trying to establish a new world order where they want the US to go back to its like pre-Bretton Woods, like that era where it was number one while it was still able to have the US dollar as the global reserve currency. So the problem is twofold. One is that when you have a system where your currency is the global reserve currency, you're going to run into everything I just explained before, right? That you're going to have huge trade imbalances. Your country is going to be really expensive. And so countries are not going to import as much of your goods because your price is so expensive, right? Part of the reason why we have trade deficits, guys, is as much as the Trump rhetoric is trying to make it seem like these countries are malicious and they hate America, it's actually just really simple. It's the fact that you have countries that, let's say, produce, I don't know, like some commodity, right? Like soybeans, and they want to export it to the US. Well, when the US pays for it, they're paying for it, gets converted, right? From the US dollar to that local currency, and that local currency is really cheap. But if that poor country, so to speak, were to import a US manufactured good, they would have to convert their currency to the US dollar, and the US dollar is freaking expensive. So that's really the simple answer to why we have trade imbalances, right? But let's go a little bit deeper. The problem is that you have the US dollar as the global reserve currency. You have these trade imbalances, right? And we still want the US to be the main economic powerhouse. How do we get to that point? We get it through industrialization. And so when you analyze the speeches, the rhetoric, the papers that are published by Trump's economic advisors, Scott Bessent and Stephen Miran, their game plan is that they want the US to be industrialized, meaning they want to bring back US manufacturing. But how do you bring back US manufacturing when the US manufacturing has been essentially declining exponentially the past few decades? Well, the plan is that you have to start the trade war, because the global trading system is what created this decline in US manufacturing in the first place. But what kills me is that the US designed this. This was a US created disaster. And so what their plan is, I think, right, this is just my claim, my analysis, is that Trump is starting with these aggressive tariffs because he's trying to create negotiating power. He's trying to create leverage, right? Because just because you have, let's say, money or you have military power doesn't necessarily mean that you can use it in a way that's strategic, right? You need something to negotiate with. And so Trump is using these tariffs to basically show the world, like, we mean business. Like, we're serious about this. We're gonna actually tariff the crap out of you, and we're not gonna back down. That's why he's being so bold. You know, when you ask yourself, why would Trump choose to crash their own market, right? Because this hurts US companies. When you look at the Magnificent Seven, as they say, the companies that tend to do very well when the stock market is up and they're crashing, these are all US companies, right? Like, why would Trump choose to do that to his own country? Well, the reason why is because he's first trying to show the world, if we're going to go down, you're coming down with us. Everyone is going to come down if this doesn't stop. If this current corruption in the trading system that the US built doesn't stop. So that's step number one. Step number two is then they want the retaliatory tariffs to start. So they want countries to essentially establish their own tariffs against the US. And why they want this to happen is they want to level the playing field. They want basically the current trade imbalances and all of the deficits, they want it to kind of like level out to an equal playing field. So if you have, because remember, during the free trade era that the US designed, the US allowed European and other countries like Japan to establish tariffs against the US. They did this on purpose because they wanted those countries to get richer. Simultaneously, the US allowed them to have access to US consumers. And so what Trump is trying to do is that he's trying to invoke retaliatory tariffs so that this imbalance between the tariffs between those countries are all kind of leveled out. And then the third step that I think is going to happen is that Trump is going to use this to establish a new agreement, right? A new world order where the US will go back to being its number one manufacturing power. The US will give economic and military support for its allies. And the goal is to essentially discount China. And I don't know if that means that they will have to do some type of compromise with China, but the larger picture is that China and BRICS countries, which are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have essentially dominated the economic power compared to the G7 countries. So the G7 countries are the US, Japan, Western European countries, Australia, etc. And BRICS are what I just said. So you have two new world kind of like leagues that are forming. And this is a threat to US security, right? Because recently, the BRICS countries surpassed the economic manufacturing power of G7 countries. And so when you kind of zoom out and you look at the bigger picture, this is kind of a showdown between like almost like capital and communism. It's basically Cold War all over again, but with like the modern technology and the internet. You know, like we're living in a different age, but history loves to repeat itself, right? And so this is where I go into my analysis, where I argue I don't think it's going to work out in America's favor the way that Trump wants it to, because we have to think in long-term strategies. We cannot think in 4-year cycles. This is a major deficit in American political discourse, is that because we constantly have the 4-year elections with our president, we tend to like think that things are going to change a lot with each administration. And what we really like struggle with as a country is we struggle to think about the US as just one entity and how to devise like a 40, 50, 60-year plan. And so this is a major difference between this and BRICS countries, because BRICS countries, they are, I hate to say this, but more authoritarian. Their regimes are more authoritarian, right? They don't have as much of a democratic say. Like China is a communist country, right? Russia is an authoritarian regime. It's an oligarchy. And so they don't have this problem the way the US does, because their rulers, right? Their oligarchs, their authoritarian regime, they're able to devise plans that are like 50, 60 years ahead. And they're able to like almost like force the country to comply. The US, we can't do that because we have a democratic republic. So we're constantly changing the administration. And so why I say that Trump's plan is not going to work is because in order for the US to be re-industrialized, we're going to need decades of massive government intervention and economic reinvestment. Okay, think about just the local ecosystem of an economy that is focused on manufacturing. Let's say automakers, just for an example. You need first the factory that's going to manufacture the cars. But then you also need the workers. You need the workers to be skilled. They need to have gone through some sort of training and work experience to understand how to put the cars together, how to operate the technology, the machinery. Then you need the capital investment into the technology, the machinery, the automation. And then you need engineers. You need engineers to actually understand how to design the cars, right? Let's say Tesla. How did those engineers get to their position? They need college education. And so there's like a whole like ecosystem that goes into reviving a particular industry, and that's just one. Imagine trying to revive all the industries across the board to focus on manufacturing in the US. This is going to be it's going to take decades and decades of a lot of intervention and from the government and from the private sector. And I argue that I just don't see this happening. I really don't see the US being able to pull this off. And another thing too that I was thinking of is that the attitudes have changed a lot. And this is where I kind of go into a side rant. And I'm going to make another video on this. But our understanding in the West, you know, I grew up in America, right? I studied mostly from a Western lens. We have a gap in our understanding of the world because the world changed so much the past few decades and our education system has not caught up to that. So let me explain. I am 5 years out of college, okay? So I graduated high school in 2016, and then I went to university. I went to 2 universities. I went to Boston University for sociology and international relations, and then I went to Cornell University for economics and finance. So when I was taking these classes, right, I was learning about American history first in high school, and then world history. And then when I went to college, the classes that I was taking, they mainly focused on economic policies and history that are pretty much through the 1900s to like maybe early 2000s. And then every now and then there will be like elective courses and classes where they looked at kind of like the new changes, right? Like AI and technology, advancements in healthcare. But those were seen as more like fun classes, like classes just for, your own knowledge. But the meat of my understanding of history and international relations and diplomacy is pretty much outdated. And it's not, I don't know if it's a fault of the American education system. I'm going to do another video on that, going into why college has kind of failed us. But it's more about just the fact that the West has not updated our history books. So when you look at like the average American's understanding of like world history, it's like pretty much like Roman Empire, like the ancient Greeks, to like the late 1900s. And then there's like a gap between about 2006, I want to say, to like now. And that gap is why there's so much misinformation and confusion in American politics, because our understanding of the world is when the West was exceptional, right? Like we talk about Western exceptionalism, this idea that the West created the largest and greatest civilizations known to mankind, and through colonialism, through imperialism, through World War I and World War II, we established the New World Order. We know all this, but in our day-to-day life, in the actual analysis of what is happening today in 2025, we're not seeing that Western exceptionalism. We're seeing BRICS countries outdo G7 countries in the economy. We're seeing American towns just completely devastated with wealth inequality. We see that the best and the brightest are not Americans, right? If you look at like the Ivy Leagues, for example, in America, they're filled with international students. So it's like, we're not the smartest. We're losing our status as the richest. And it's like, wait, but I learned in school that America and the West was always going to be dominant. And so this is why I say that Trump's plan, I don't think it's going to play out to the maximum level that will benefit Americans, because the world has changed a lot, guys. The world has, like, the more I study this and research this, the more even I am like blown at my ignorance. I'm going to do a separate case study on the rise of China, but I cannot emphasize this enough, guys. We are on the precipice of a new world order, right? The things that we learned in history class are not as relevant anymore. And the problem is that the way that the US was able to essentially strong arm other countries to comply with its economic policies, I don't see those same countries being as agreeable, right? If you take India, for example, India was a British colonized country, and Britain was able to enrich itself a lot by essentially stealing, right? Like forcing the resources to be extracted from India back to Britain. But now we look at India today, one of the largest growing economies, right? Just like the Indian billionaires are like crazy, right? Like there are billionaires that are worth like 95 billion, I think, in India. You see a huge industrialization of India, and India aligning itself with countries like China. China is the second largest GDP in the world, and it's soon to surpass the US. These countries are not gonna behave the way that they used to, because, to be quite frank, these countries are pretty much fed up with Western countries always dominating. Today, if you try to do that to China, it's not going to work, right? Because China is just too big. It's too big now. It has a huge population, a huge military backing, It has a massive economy. You have some of the richest people in the world in China, and China has been doing its own strategic initiatives. For example, the Belt Road Initiative, where it was strategically, quietly building up economic allies in hundreds of countries, guys. Like we in the West, we're not facing this reality because we have this gap in our timeline of our understanding of the world powers. And so, do I think that Trump will be able to pull off an agreement, something like Bretton Woods, where they're able to establish the US as still the global reserve currency and still reindustrialize the US manufacturing power? I highly doubt that. We will have to just see how it plays out. I do think that there's going to be that's going to happen, some sort of compromise, right? Where you're going to have winners and losers. But I don't see the US ever regaining its status to what it used to be, simply because the other countries, they've gotten too rich. They're too rich, they're too powerful, and they have competing ideologies, both in terms of how they want to govern their nation, how they want to establish, like you have communism, we have socialism, we have capitalism, these different competing economic ideologies. It's not the same system that was happening during the Cold War. And so it's really shocking when you think about it, because this was like the US designed this. And now this seems to be the way in which the US is going to collapse, right? And so we have to really see how this is going to play out. The plan by the Trump administration, that I argue, is that economists such as Stephen Miran, they're hoping that through this trade war, the US dollar will weaken while still maintaining its status as the global reserve currency. Do I think that can happen? Sure. I think that it's possible, but do I think it's going to happen to the maximum effect, where it's going to completely change the economy of the US? I don't think so. And that's my claim. We'll just have to keep monitoring the situation and see these new developments as new data comes in, and we're going to see how other countries react. I might be able to adjust my hypothesis, but for now, I think that this trade war is going to hurt Americans the most, particularly the middle and working class Americans, and I don't think it's going to be as effective as the Trump administration is hoping. So in the next video, it's going to be kind of a case study on what are the factors that drive the collapse of a nation, right? Because I feel like right now, politically, the US is at a turning point, an inflection point, right? And I want to present my research as to what are the historical patterns that we see before an empire collapses or rises. So that will be the next video. I will see you then.